Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, Lettuce Head Fanfics. Back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku Could Steal and Return Quirks. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. It was just a regular day. The weather was clear and bright, and all the children were playing at the park. Izuku, very excited, told Bakugo that he thought Bakugo was cool and hoped his quirk would be as impressive. Bakugo boasted that Izuku should not dream too highly and bragged that he would be better than All Might himself. The two boys, Izuku Midoriya and Katsuki Bakugo, were 3 years old and had been best friends for as long as they could remember. Bakugo already had his quirk, which allowed him to create explosions in his hands. Most kids got theirs before they turned 4, but Izuku was still waiting. Bakugo continued to show off his quirk and to talk about how he would become the greatest hero and Izuku would be his sidekick. Izuku's family was far from normal. His father, Hisashi Midoriya, was the villain All for One, who had killed many people and could steal others' quirks. Izuku's mother, Inko Midoriya, was surprisingly ordinary, kind, caring, and able to levitate small objects. Izuku's older brother, Tamura Midoriya, could disintegrate anything by touch and was heading down the same path as their father. Izuku loved his brother even though they were not related by blood. Hisashi had found Tamura crying in an alley after his quirk manifested and had brought him into the family after a tragic accident wiped out his previous household. Despite their differences, they were still a family. Hisashi and Tamura often tried to persuade Izuku that villains were better than heroes, but Izuku never gave up his dream of becoming the #1 hero, just like All Might. A year passed. Izuku was 4 now and still had not gotten his quirk, but he remained optimistic, wondering if he was just a late bloomer. He slipped on his shoes and ran to the neighborhood park to find Bakugo. Bakugo's spiky blonde hair made him easy to spot. Izuku greeted Bakugo warmly, and Bakugo immediately asked if Izuku had gotten his quirk that day. Izuku answered shyly that not yet, but he was sure it would come soon. Bakugo teased that Izuku needed a quirk to be his sidekick. The boys began to play until a winged child approached and shoved Izuku to the ground. Bakugo reacted angrily, calling out the bully. The winged child sneered that Izuku probably had no quirk and pushed him again, then kicked him and called him a stupid name. Izuku sat on the ground rubbing his head and protested that he was not quirkless, only that his quirk had not shown yet. Bakugo defended him and told the bully there was no need to push him. The winged child rolled his eyes and pushed past Bakugo, then began to insult Izuku. Bakugo decided to act. He created small explosions in his hands as a warning. When the bully did not back away, Bakugo released more power and sent the kid reeling into the swing set. The bully scrambled to his feet, terrified, and fled the park. After the bully left, Bakugo helped Izuku to his feet. Izuku thanked Bakugo with wide eyes and admiration. Bakugo told Izuku he needed to learn to protect himself because Bakugo would not always be there to do it. Izuku promised that once he got his quirk they would fight crime together. He declared that Bakugo would be the strongest hero and he would be the sidekick, and together they would be unstoppable. After they finished playing, the sun began to set. The two boys said their goodbyes and went home. Izuku was almost to his house when he heard something moving behind him. He turned and found the winged boy from earlier standing there. The boy shoved Izuku over and Izuku hit the pavement hard. The winged boy taunted Izuku, calling him the nickname he had heard others use. Izuku answered shyly that his name was Izuku, but the bully insisted the nickname fit better. The bully had a fresh bump on his head where he had landed earlier and sharp claws at the tips of his wings that glinted in the light. Izuku's knee was scraped and bleeding, and he began to cry. The bully mocked him further. The winged boy raised his wings as if to strike, and Izuku closed his eyes, bracing for the blow. Instead of a hit, he felt a light tap on his shoulder and then a strange sensation along his back. When he opened his eyes, the bully stood frozen in horror. Izuku looked down and realized the red wings that had been on the bully's back were gone. He felt movement and discovered that the wings were now on him, responding to his own will when he moved them to test them. The bully panicked and began to shout, accusing Izuku of stealing the wings. At that moment Bakugo arrived, having heard the commotion. He had earlier demanded that the other boy leave Izuku alone, and now he turned toward the new disturbance. Bakugu's face registered shock as he saw Izuku with wings he had never had before. Bakugu whispered Izuku's name and asked why Izuku had wings. The bully, still terrified, yelled that the wings had been taken from him. Bakugu screamed for his powers to be returned, tears running down his face. Izuku stammered that he did not know how. He thought back to what had caused the transformation and realized that when they had made contact, Bakugu's wings had switched over. Izuku told him to wait and said he might know how to give them back. Bakugu, furious, demanded that he do it. Izuku hesitated. The room went quiet when Izuku said no. Bakugu's face drained of color and he stared at his friend in confusion. He had never heard Izuku refuse anyone before. Bakugu yelled that the quirk was his and that Izuku had to give it back. Izuku smiled a little and said he would not return it until Bakugu apologized. Bakugu asked what would happen if he refused, and Izuku replied that he would keep the quirk. Bakugu protested that it was his, and asked what was stopping Izuku. Bakugu had never seen this side of Izuku. He was usually kind and gentle, but Izuku was standing firm for an apology. When Bakugu muttered that his mother said people always had to apologize, he offered a reluctant, insincere apology. Izuku accepted it and asked Bakugu to stand still. Izuku walked up to Bakugu, put a hand on his shoulder, and closed his eyes. He felt the familiar sensation in his back and knew it was working. In the next moment, Bakugu was running away with his wings returned, and Izuku was back to normal. Bakugu exclaimed that it had been so cool and rushed over to Izuku, explaining that this was why Izuku's quirk had not manifested. Izuku could steal other people's quirks. As Izuku began to walk toward his friend, a sharp pain shot up his leg and he sat down on the floor. Bakugu ran to him and saw the scrape, and Izuku began to cry again. Bakugu panicked, not knowing how to comfort his friend, then dug into his pocket and produced an All Might plush. He gave it to Izuku and, in his best All Might voice, urged him not to cry and promised to walk him home so he would not get hurt. The two boys finally made it to Izuku's house and opened the door. Their mother, Inko, rushed in, clearly worried and asking what had happened and where they had been. Bakugu, excited and vibrating with energy, declared to Inko that he had gotten his quirk. Izuku confirmed that he had his quirk too and explained that he could steal other people's quirks, use them, and give them back. Inko looked relieved and happy for her son. Hazashi, Izuku's white-haired father who had been dozing in the living room, came in and became fully awake when he heard the news. He reacted with pure joy at the revelation that Izuku could help teach Bakugu to master his own ability. Bakugu enthusiastically described how he had made a bully run away and how awesome it had been. Inko picked up Izuku and spun him around, delighted. She mentioned on the phone that Bakugu's mother was looking for her son. Bakugu grumbled but left, shouting at his mother across the street in his usual fiery tone, which made Izuku giggle. Hazashi confirmed that Izuku had acquired Bakugu's quirk and said he could help him master it. At that moment a blue-haired boy walked in rubbing his eyes and complaining about the noise. Tenko, the blue-haired boy, was joined by another brother, Shige. Izuku announced proudly to them that he had the same quirk as their father and therefore technically had access to many quirks. Shige complained that it was not fair, and Hazashi hoped the brothers would not start an argument. To celebrate, Hazashi suggested they all go out to eat. Everyone agreed enthusiastically and Izuku insisted on Denny's. The family humorously bickered about who would get milkshakes, with Tenko and Izuku both clamoring for one. As they walked to the car, Hazashi proposed a contest. Whoever could stay quiet the longest would earn a milkshake. The two boys immediately tried to remain silent, poking each other in attempts to make the other talk, while the rest of the family watched and smiled. 10 years later, in their last year of middle school, Izuku Midoriya and Katsuki Bakugu remained friends. They trained together, got stronger, and planned for their futures. Izuku still had bullies who mocked him for having a villain's quirk and called him Deku. Bakugu would put them in their place when he was around, but he was not always there. Izuku could have taken their quirks and walked away, but he was too kind for that and knew it would only prove them right. He never mentioned his father, who had become a well-known villain. When asked, he said he did not know his father and that he had no brother. The Bakugas and most others never learned Mr. Midoriya's occupation and never asked. It was only 2 weeks until Izuku and Bakugo finished school and could apply to UA, their dream school. The teacher went on at length about high school, but Izuku had already researched everything and was filling in his notebook with hero profiles instead. There was one hero he had not finished writing about yet. Izuku's notes listed the hero Shinji Nishiya, hero name Kamui Woods. He recorded the birthday as May 20th, the age at first appearance as 27, current age 29, male, height 5 feet 6 inches, 168 centimeters, brown eyes, blood type A, and the quirk name Arbor. A hand suddenly snatched his pencil. Tsubasa, the winged boy, grabbed it and mocked Izuku for his notes, pointing out that he had even written down eye color and warning him to stop studying heroes because, in Tsubasa's opinion, Izuku would never be one. Tsubasa and his friends Haru and Daiki laughed. Tsubasa took Izuku's notebook and handed it to Haru, who used his scissorhand quirk to shred several pages. Haru then threw the torn notebook out the window and over the back wall. Tsubasa added a taunt that Izuku would never be a hero, and the 3 boys left the classroom. Izuku ran to the window and saw the notebook floating in a small water bucket along the back wall. He finished packing his books and left the room, thinking about the cruelty of the morning. As he walked toward the back of the school to retrieve the notebook, the memory of the taunts replayed in his head. He found the notebook bobbing in the bucket and sighed. He continued home, talking to himself to stay calm. While passing through a long tunnel, Izuku entertained himself with a careful impression of his hero idol. The impression was interrupted by a sudden rumble. A grate burst open, and a mass of animated sludge slid out from the sewer. The living sludge moved with malicious intent and wrapped itself around Izuku, pressing against him and trying to pull him in. He struggled, but the sludge slipped like water through his fingers. It pressed against his mouth, cutting off his breath. He fought to push it away, but it remained fluid and ungraspable. Izuku briefly considered using someone else's quirk to escape, but he knew taking one without permission would be illegal and could make him look like the villain if a hero arrived. He feared being blamed if help came while he acted first. Dizziness crept in as his vision blurred, and he started to lose consciousness. A booming voice declared that help had arrived. The sludge released its grip at the sound, and Izuku collapsed from lack of oxygen. When he came to, there was tapping on his cheek. He found himself face to face with his idol All Might, who was very much real and very much energetic. All Might checked that Izuku was alive, then moved to secure the sludge creature in empty cola bottles in a quick, efficient, almost theatrical motion. All Might then announced that he had to take the creature away, and with a single powerful leap he launched into the sky. About 209 feet up, All Might felt something snag his leg and realized Izuku had wrapped himself around it. All Might, aware of his time limits, worried over where to set Izuku down where there would be no reporters. He decided on the roof of a nearby office building and prepared to land quickly. All Might set Izuku down on the rooftop and instructed him to knock on the door and someone inside would eventually let him in, then said he had to go. Izuku's voice wavered as he asked if he could become a hero. He struggled to hide the mix of excitement and fear in his question, explaining that he could take others' quirks and that people said he would only make a good villain. He asked if he could still hope to be like All Might. A cloud of smoke suddenly surrounded All Might as if from his own coughing. When the smoke cleared, the powerful figure was gone, replaced by a thin, skeletal man with shaggy yellow hair obscuring his eyes. Izuku reacted with shock and alarm at the unexpected change. Izuku felt a mix of confusion and fear as he stood on the rooftop with the small, weathered man who used to be All Might. Izuku asked where the other person was. Toshinori assured Izuku that he was All Might, but then he coughed harshly and dirted his oversized shirt. Toshinori lifted the hem of his shirt to show that years of injuries and surgery had left his body altered and fragile, and he explained that he could only stay strong for short stretches of time before reverting to that weaker state. Izuku protested that the real All Might was a giant of a man who always saved everyone with a fearless smile. Toshinori replied that there was a lot of fear behind that smile and that heroes risked their lives every day. Toshinori cautioned that becoming a hero would be difficult without proper abilities, and suggested other paths like becoming a police officer, reminding Izuku to keep his dreams realistic. Izuku stood speechless as Toshinori walked back inside and shut the door. In Izuku's mind, even All Might didn't believe in him. He tried not to cry, deep down he had expected this. Toshinori began to descend the stairs toward the ground floor and then realized that the bottles he had been carrying, containers holding samples of the enemy substance, were gone. Toshinori worried that he must have dropped them while moving. Somewhere else, Bakugo had finished an appointment and decided to take a shortcut through a sketchy alley on his way to ask Izuku for work. He kicked a crushed can out of boredom. It rolled behind a trash bin and knocked over a bottle, the cap falling off. He kept walking without retrieving it. As Bakugo continued, a strange sound made him immediately get into a fighting stance. He turned and faced a giant sludge-like creature. He fired at it, but the blasts had little effect. The creature behaved like shifting liquid, resisting his attacks. Bakugo refused to back down and kept fighting, but the monster's fluid form wrapped around him and trapped him without showing any sign of injury. Meanwhile, Izuku had finally mustered the courage to leave the roof and head toward home to meet Kaken. Ahead he heard explosions and screams. From a distance he saw fire and destruction, and above the building something like a ribbon of slime moved through the air. He assumed the heroes would handle it and considered turning back, but then he realized his house was in the direction of the chaos. Fear shot through him and he ran toward his neighborhood. When Izuku arrived, the chaos had mostly calmed and the villain had been captured, but smoke and fire still stood over parts of the street. He searched frantically for his house. At first he thought he must be in the wrong place, but then he saw his house burning, part of the roof collapsed. He ran toward it and heard someone call his name, but he didn't stop. He had to find his mother. Izuku pushed through the front door into a living room scorched and barely recognizable. More of the roof creaked, and without any power to rely on, Izuku dodged falling beams and sprinted toward his mother's room. The bedroom door was stuck. Izuku backed up, ran, and threw himself at it, breaking it off its hinges and landing on the fallen door. A gust of smoke poured from the room, and Izuku crawled low to avoid inhaling too much. Relying on his memory of the layout, he moved around the bed toward the left where his mother slept. He was relieved to find that his mother was alive but trapped beneath a large piece of fallen ceiling material. The wood pressed across both of Inko's legs and her torso. Inko had deep wounds on her arms and face that looked very painful. She coughed and told Izuku that he needed to leave. Izuku insisted that he could not leave her. Inko reached up and held the side of her son's face, explaining through coughs that both her legs were broken and that she had inhaled too much smoke, and she would not be able to get out in time. She told him he could escape and urged him to remember her. Izuku sobbed that he could not leave her. Inko urged him to take her quirk so he could remember her and make her proud. She kept a loving smile even while crying. Izuku followed her instructions and felt the quirk flow through him. Inko whispered goodbye, and her hand slipped from his face and fell to the floor as she passed away. Izuku called for his mother over and over, distraught. He grabbed her hand and held it to his face, screaming and refusing to accept what had happened. Then a rescuer wrapped a warm hand around his shoulder and held him. The rescuer helped Izuku to his feet and guided him out of the burning house. Izuku walked on in stunned silence with tear-streaked cheeks, unable to shake the image of his mother trapped beneath a support beam. He replayed the thought that it was all his fault until his stomach ached. She was gone. Izuku was taken to the hospital by a police car for a checkup and then transported to the police station to be processed. He sat in the interrogation room waiting to be questioned so officials could identify him and decide where he should go next. Growing impatient, Izuku left the room and walked the station halls in search of the detective. As he turned a corner, he overheard voices coming from the nearest office. He recognized Tsukachi's voice and crept closer to listen. Tsukachi was arguing with Endeavor about the fire. Tsukachi said that Izuku had lost his mother because of what happened, while Endeavor insisted he had taken down a villain and that was what mattered most. Endeavor argued that more lives would have been lost otherwise and downplayed the importance of one middle-aged woman compared to many lives. Tsukachi replied that the woman had been important to her son, that the father had been absent for a long time and the boy had no siblings, and that no one could truly understand what it was like for a child to lose a mother. Tsukachi warned that if Endeavor were not a hero, legal consequences would likely follow. Tsukachi left Endeavor alone in the room, and Izuku hurried back to the interrogation room without being seen. Detective Tsukachi then entered the room and offered condolences. He said he was sorry for Izuku's loss and assured him that the person responsible was in custody. Tsukachi asked for Izuku's name, age, and quirk so they could complete the identification. Izuku gave his name as Izuku Midoriya, his age as 16, and, after a moment of hesitation, told Tsukachi that he had the same quirk as his mother and that it was not very strong. Tsukachi explained that someone had come by earlier and offered to let Izuku stay with them for now, naming Matsuki Bakugo, and asked if Izuku knew where she lived. Izuku answered that he did, and Tsukachi said the department was busy with the legality of the incident but that Izuku would be released and could walk to the Bakugo's home. All of Izuku's answers were delivered in a hollow voice as he stared at the floor. He left the station and stepped into bright sunlight, shielding his eyes until they adjusted. He began walking toward the Bakugo's house along a route he had taken countless times. About halfway there he heard a sudden whooshing sound and looked up to see a purple and black portal open. Tenko stepped out, hair shaggy and face rough from lack of care. Tenko approached and explained that he was not known by the pros yet, so being seen was not a concern. Tenko and his father said they had heard about what had happened to Izuku's mother and they wanted Izuku to come to their base and live with them because they did not want him to be alone. Izuku, still grieving but touched by the offer, agreed to go with them. Izuku asked Tenko to teach him how to fight and how to take people down. Tenko was shocked. He had never heard his brother express a desire to kill anyone before, let alone a hero, but he was also quietly pleased that Izuku wanted to take action. Tenko asked why. Izuku explained that he had awakened to the corruption in their society. He recounted the conversation he had heard between Inspector Tsukachi and Endeavor, describing plans to eliminate or neutralize corrupt heroes. Tenko reacted with disbelief and anger, noting that Endeavor still refused to admit his mistakes and that the system was protecting its image while truth and accountability were being twisted. Izuku shifted from sadness to resolve, determined to cleanse the system of corrupt heroes so the legitimate ones could thrive. He made it clear that he would never harm innocent or genuinely heroic people who did nothing wrong and did not deserve punishment. Tenko asked if Izuku intended to join the League of Villains. Izuku agreed but said too many people knew him and he needed a new name. He chose Deku. Bakugo and Matsuki sat at home waiting for Izuku to arrive, but he never came. It had been 4 hours since Matsuki had visited the station and she grew worried. Bakugo kept up an angry, unconcerned facade, but inside he felt sorrow for his friend and for the news of Izuku's Aunt Inko's death. He had never lost anyone before. The unfamiliar pain made him want to be there for Izuku when he returned. Still, Izuku did not return. After 2 more hours with no sign of Izuku, Matsuki called the station to inquire about his release. Matsuki asked to speak with head detective Tsukachi and put the call on speaker so Bakugo could hear. Tsukachi identified himself and explained that Izuku had been released 4 hours earlier, asking whether Izuku was not at their home. Matsuki answered that he was not, and Tsukachi promised to send officers out to look for him. Bakugo looked as if he had seen a ghost. His eyes widened and his hands trembled. He demanded to go find Izuku immediately, insisting that his friend was too weak to defend himself. Without waiting for Matsuki to stop him, Bakugo grabbed his shoes and ran toward the station, trying to cover every route Izuku might have taken. He called Izuku's name as he searched and suddenly collided with a hooded stranger dressed in black. The man told him to watch where he was going. Bakugo snapped back, and the stranger struck him, sending him stumbling backward. The blow was strong enough to leave Bakugo struggling to stay conscious as the stranger approached, grabbed the rim of his shirt, and threw him into the street. Bakugo flew past some officers who were searching for Izuku, which drew their attention. The officers moved to the unconscious boy to check on him and prepared to restrain the attacker. The hooded man charged toward the officers, but before he could get far, the underground hero Eraserhead arrived. Eraserhead quickly subdued the villain with his scarf and handed him over to the police. One officer reassured that Bakugo would be fine and that he had only been knocked out. Eraserhead acknowledged the thanks and then left, hopping onto a nearby roof and disappearing into the night. Later, Bakugo heard voices and recognized one as familiar, which caused him to open his eyes. He found himself in a black, limitless space and saw two boys nearby. One was his longtime friend Izuku Midoriya, who stood with his usual cheerful expression gone, speaking to a man with shaggy blue hair whose face Bakugo could not make out clearly. Izuku's tone was flat and serious. Bakugo called Izuku's name repeatedly and tried to get his attention, but Izuku continued talking as if unaware. Frustrated, Bakugo moved closer, grabbed Izuku, and shook him while still calling his name. Suddenly the ground opened beneath Bakugo and swallowed him. He fell for what felt like forever and landed without injury. When he pushed himself back up, Izuku stood a few feet away with his back turned. Izuku accused Bakugo, saying that it was Bakugo's fault that Izuku was gone and that if Bakugo had been there, Izuku would have been safe. Bakugo denied the claim and insisted it was not his fault, but the accusation vanished and then reappeared behind him. Voices echoed that it was his fault, growing louder and more relentless until Bakugo covered his ears and demanded that it stop. Bakugo then jerked awake in a hospital room, breathing hard. He had been dreaming. He was drenched in sweat and had soaked the sheets. He tried to calm himself, but the voice in his head kept echoing. Bakugo forced himself to ignore it for the moment. A doctor entered the room and noted that he was awake, then left to fetch his mother. Matsuki arrived quickly, tall and spiky-haired, clearly furious. Matsuki scolded him for being reckless and told him how worried she had been when she received the call that he was in the hospital. She gave him a sharp, maternal smack on the top of his head. Bakugo snapped back angrily that she should not hit him again. A nearby nurse looked frightened and relieved at the same time, unsure why they were arguing. Matsuki restrained her son to prevent him from lashing out while she continued to berate him for his recklessness. After a while, Bakugo was discharged from the hospital and he and his mother drove home. Matsuki spoke calmly but firmly about her worry, urging Katsuki to be more careful and warning that his lack of fear was dangerous. For once, Matsuki's tone conveyed sincere concern. Bakugo replied that he would try, reluctant to show more than that. Matsuki smiled and thanked him. Bakugo rolled his eyes and watched the trees and birds pass by from the car window. He wondered if his friend was out there somewhere, free like those birds, though he knew deep down that probably was not the case. Izuku sat at a small counter in a dingy bar, drinking a boxed orange juice through a tiny straw. A man who appeared to be made of purple smoke, with a flicker of yellow where an eye might be, worked behind the counter. The smoke man refilled Izuku's drink, noting that the first box was almost gone and asking how Izuku was holding up. Izuku had been using the name Deku for himself for some time now. He answered sternly and flatly that he preferred that name. It fit the hollow, useless feeling he carried since his mother's death a week earlier. He blamed himself for not helping his mother when she needed him, and guilt gnawed at him when he learned Katsuki had been hurt in a villain attack. The taunts he had endured over the years were starting to feel true, and the League had tried to welcome him because many of them knew the sting of loss. The smoke man expressed sympathy and then opened a portal and left the bar. Deku finished his juice in a dull, lifeless way while his thoughts kept returning to the night's events. He fought the urge to break down in public. He did not want the attention or to rely on anyone for comfort. His shaggy-haired brother Tenko, commonly called Shigaraki, approached and asked how he was doing. Deku tried to deflect, asking Tenko how he felt about the loss since it had been his mother too. Tenko admitted that he had not been close to her and that she disapproved of his villainous life, so he could only imagine how much it meant to Deku. The conversation grew heavy and silent. Deku could not hold back any longer. He began to sob, covering his face with his hands. Tenko, taken aback but not entirely surprised, wrapped his arms around his brother. He wore quirk-canceling gloves to make sure he could comfort Deku without risking harm. Tenko hushed him gently and let him release his grief. Deku cried until the tears finally subsided. He looked up at Tenko's red eyes and thanked him, then drifted to sleep still leaning on his brother. Tenko told him to sleep, expressing that he was too young to carry such sorrow and that he hoped Deku would find happiness again someday. Tenko quietly carried his brother back to his room, placed him in bed, and tucked him in. He then left the room and went back to work. Deku woke up in a dimly lit room, lying on a lumpy mattress. It took him a minute to remember where he was and how he had gotten there. He guessed his brother had brought him there. He slowly sat up and let his eyes adjust. When he found the light, he had to shut his eyes against the sudden brightness. He walked over to a small pile of clothes Tenko had retrieved for him after his previous belongings had been burned beyond use. He shifted through them looking for something comfortable that would not make him look like a homeless person. He chose a hooded top, pulled the hood up, and slipped on his favorite and only pair of red shoes. He did not want to interact with anyone, but he was starving. After a minute of debate, he decided to get some food and eat it in his room. He opened his door, poked his head around the corner to check for anyone in the hallway, and when no one was there, he tiptoed toward the kitchen. He was almost to the doorway when he noticed the television had been left on. He picked up the remote to turn it off and saw a familiar face on the screen, Kaken. The television news reported that a young boy had been attacked by a villain the previous night and had been found unconscious by the police. The report said the boy had been taken to the hospital with a concussion after searching for a friend who had gone missing the same day. The broadcast added that a pro-hero had helped capture the villain but provided no immediate update on the boy's condition. Deku was stunned to learn that Kaken had been attacked while looking for him. He blamed himself, thinking that if not for him, Kaken would have been safe at home having a nice dinner instead of in the hospital. He collapsed to the floor and began to sob uncontrollably. The remote slipped from his hand, bounced off the couch, and landed on the floor. Shigaraki entered the room carrying a clear glass with a cold drink. He looked up and saw his brother crying on the floor. He set the glass on a nearby table and hurried to his side. He knelt beside Deku and hesitated to hug him because his gloves were not on, so his hands hovered awkwardly. Shigaraki glanced at the television and recognized the headline. He already knew about the incident from keeping tabs on local crime, but it had not occurred to him how Deku would react to the news. With his gloves in the other room, he could not do much physically, so he offered reassurance instead. He told Deku that a coworker had confirmed the injured boy had already made a full recovery and had been discharged, and that the news broadcast had been late with its update. Despite his gruff exterior, Shigaraki showed genuine concern for his brother when it mattered. Deku gradually stopped crying. The two brothers stood and left the room together. Shigaraki had to run back to retrieve his drink and accidentally disintegrated it, swearing under his breath. They moved on with their day, taking care of what needed to be done. He had inherited both of his parents' quirks and could produce ice and fire. For the most part, he had seemed like a normal little kid, running around, making messes, yelling and screaming. That changed after his mother accidentally burned his face with a mug of hot tea. After that, he grew dull and lifeless, barely talking and showing almost no emotion. Trauma had reshaped him in ways that left a quiet hollowness. Deku had been studying the Todoroki family for 3 hours when night fell. Research could only take him so far. He wanted to see how the family functioned in person instead of relying on a single article. He needed a plan. After thinking it over, he decided to observe each member one by one to gather more information about this odd household. He felt excited at the prospect of new discoveries and the possibilities the information might bring. The next morning, Deku woke full of energy. It was not joy so much as eager anticipation. He dressed in the villain costume Tenko had given him the day before, then walked to one of the doors in the hallway and paused. He pulled a key from his jacket pocket and used it to open the door. Inside the room, everything was different from the rest of the building. It was clean and new, the walls, floor and ceiling lined with metal. Rows of metal shelves held neatly organized weapons, everything from compact sidearms to larger firearms, and a mix of melee options. Hooks along the walls displayed knives in ordered rows, smaller throwing knives closer by, larger blades on the shelves. Deku's eyes landed on a small set of dual throwing knives with snakes engraved on the handles. They were slim and balanced. He lifted one, feeling the smooth handle and grazing the blade tip with his fingertip before pulling back. The blade caught the light with a faint emerald tint. After a few moments, Deku flipped the knife once in the air and caught it, then slid both blades into a special holder up each sleeve. He locked the room behind him and left. Deku walked into the kitchen and took a seat at the bar. A friendly, mist-like figure approached to take his order. The figure introduced himself as Kurojiri and asked what Deku wanted to drink and eat. Deku requested orange juice and a bowl of katsudon. Kurojiri set to work preparing the order, and when it was ready he placed the steaming bowl in front of the boy. Deku picked up the chopsticks and ate carefully, pacing himself to avoid burning his mouth. He felt a small lift in his mood as he ate. Kurojiri watched the young boy with a quiet warmth, pleased to see Deku recovering some of his energy. The caretaker knew Deku still had a long road ahead, but this moment of normalcy was important. When Deku finished, he handed the empty dishes back and paused for a second to make sure the smoke-formed hands had a secure grip before letting go. Then he stood and walked toward the door. Deku raised his hand and grabbed the handle on the rotted door. He turned it and pushed the door open. The outside looked much like the inside. Mold clung to the walls and signs of old termite damage were obvious. The bar sat in a cramped alley with one or two other shops. Further down the alley, a store looked as if it had been looted and then abandoned. The roof had holes and only 2 walls remained. The sign above was hard to read, but Deku was fairly sure it advertised used drags. He did not understand how drags could be sold as used, and the place appeared out of business anyway. After a minute of staring, Deku continued up the alley and stepped into the crowded street. Many shady people were huddled together, shoving and jostling to get where they were going. He watched pickpockets at work and saw people clutching their wallets to keep them safe. Deku realized he had forgotten his civilian clothes for the day. He only needed them for walking through the black market and staying overnight. He had not noticed until he reached the open street. Just as he considered turning back, a swirl of purple smoke opened in front of him. A matching hand reached through the portal holding a neat pile of folded clothes and his yellow backpack. Deku took the items and quickly checked what was in the stack. He felt grateful that he would not have to go all the way back to base. A smoky voice from the portal replied with a simple welcome, and then the portal and hand vanished. Deku ducked into an empty alley to change, slipped into the new clothes, and packed the suit into his yellow backpack. After slinging the bag over his shoulder, he stepped back into the street and told himself he would find Endeavor next. Deku walked through the busy street filled with people rushing to work and bumping into one another. He had researched Endeavor's patrol route, even though the hero rarely remained in one place long. Deku liked to move into other heroes' patrol areas, catching villains and increasing his own arrest record. He still managed to cover his assigned route sometimes, but today he wandered through unfamiliar territory, eyes scanning for trouble. A large explosion erupted nearby. Deku knew that wherever explosions happened, Endeavor was likely to respond. He sprinted toward the source and began to search through the chaos. Endeavor stood on the hood of a car, holding a defeated villain by his shirt. It was a small-time criminal, but Endeavor's presence dominated the scene. The crowd cheered and applauded the hero's work. Deku remained silent among the noise, staring at the flame-wreathed figure at the center of the commotion. He told himself to join the applause to blend in, but his body refused. He hated Endeavor. Even if the hero's public image was crafted, Deku could never cheer for the man he believed responsible for his mother's fate. Endeavor scanned the crowd as the cheers washed over him. He wondered why people were so impressed over such an insignificant villain, why they assumed this was a great accomplishment, why they might think anyone else could have done it faster. As he watched, a lone boy stood still, staring in a way that made Endeavor uneasy. The hero could not place the face but felt that something about the boy was familiar and off. Endeavor caught the boy's gaze and felt a flicker of unease. The stare was intense, full of something like hatred. He could not tell whether the boy was a threat, a jealous rival, or connected to the villain in some way. The uncertainty stirred a different kind of anger in Endeavor, an anger born of not knowing. Questions crowded his mind. Was the boy a villain? Was he angry at Endeavor? Had he been arrested before? The lack of answers made Endeavor restless. He disliked the unknown and felt compelled to find out. Flames around Endeavor surged as his temper rose, and he prepared to step down and confront the boy, but a reporter's question interrupted him. The reporter pushed at Endeavor's insecurities by asking why All Might continued to beat him in the polls and whether he was letting All Might win or simply being outshone. The reporter's smirk and provocation clearly got under Endeavor's skin. The reporter suggested that All Might was beating Endeavor not only in popularity but also in arrests. Endeavor snapped back, insisting that the polls only reflected popularity and that All Might was not stronger than he was. The reporter's taunt widened into a sharper smile, and the tension around Endeavor grew. He rejected the idea that he was allowing All Might to win and insisted he could surpass him, but the crowd and the questions kept the pressure on the hero as he faced both public adulation and private doubt. Endeavor growled at the audacity of the person and decided it was best to end the conversation. When he looked back to where Deku had been standing, the green-haired boy was gone. Meanwhile, Deku had slipped away from the crowd and stood under a nearby pavilion, leaning against one of the 4 poles that supported the canopy. He cursed under his breath that had been too close. He was relieved the nosy reporter had been there and wondered if Endeavor had noticed anything. His stomach growled and he realized, with surprise, that it was already noon. He told himself he had time to eat while Endeavor gloated and that he could always find him again later. Deku left the shelter of the pavilion and walked to a pork cutlet bowl stand as quietly as he could. He ordered a plain bowl, paid the vendor, sat at one of the many tables and ate. After finishing his meal, Deku walked to the trash can and disposed of his empty bowl and chopsticks. A slight rustling from a nearby row of trees caught his attention. He froze and then slowly approached the sound. It came again, a faint movement among the leaves. He moved toward the bush cautiously and pushed aside branches to see what was inside. He braced himself for whatever he might find and then sighed in relief when he saw a tiny kitten, barely 2 weeks old, struggling inside. The kitten appeared to have injured one of its legs and fell when it tried to run, emitting weak, distressed cries. Overcome with pity, Deku reached into the bush to lift the animal out. The kitten squirmed but was too weak to resist. Deku cradled it and carried it back to his table, placing it down gently. He tore a piece from the hem of his shirt and gathered a few small sticks from the ground, setting them beside the kitten. He examined the injured leg carefully. The injury looked like a clean break that could be supported with a simple splint. Deku aligned the leg, fitted the sticks as supports, and wrapped the cloth around them securely so the makeshift brace would hold. Because the kitten was so young, Deku expected the leg to heal quickly and the brace would only be needed for a short time. He lifted the kitten and carried it back to the bush where he had found it, lowering it gently into the sheltered spot. As he began to turn away, 2 more kittens raced out and sniffed at their injured sibling, appearing to check that it was all right. One of the kittens brushed against Deku's leg and purred, looking up at him expectantly. Deku crouched and petted the small creature. The other 2 kittens followed and soon all 3 were rubbing against him and purring contentedly. He stood and started to walk away, but each time he glanced back he saw the 3 kittens scatter and hide so he would not notice they were following him. Deku laughed softly, caught one before it could slip away, and found it looking mildly indignant at being discovered. The other 2 emerged when they realized they had been found. Deku picked them up one by one, tucked them safely into his pockets, and continued on his way with 3 new companions. Deku began to walk again and headed in the direction where he had seen Endeavor. As he arrived, Endeavor propelled himself through the air and disappeared from sight. Deku lifted the kittens out of his pocket and placed them on the ground before he started running after the flame hero. The kittens were close behind and could take shortcuts because of their size, but they still had trouble keeping up with the green-haired boy. Deku ran as fast as he could, struggling to follow Endeavor while staying out of sight. He raced across town and back again, over rooftops, under bridges and through alleys. He had almost lost sight of Endeavor a few times but was quick to find him again. Later, at sundown, fewer people were in the streets. Deku had gathered information that Endeavor's shift ended at nightfall, so the hero would be heading home soon. Endeavor finished dealing with a villain with the police, and Deku took a breath, crouched behind a wall with his hands on his knees to catch his breath. After a few more minutes, Endeavor began to walk home. Deku was relieved that Endeavor was on foot and not propelling himself with flames, since he no longer had to run. Deku stayed out of sight during most of the walk, though he had to cross the street a few times. The kittens followed and tried to stay hidden like him, but they were not very good at it. After walking for a while, Endeavor slowed, then disappeared from view. When Deku turned back, The flame hero was right behind him, towering over him with a scowl and flames rippling around his body. Endeavor demanded to know why Deku had been following him all day. Deku stammered that he did not know what Endeavor meant. Endeavor, blunt and intimidating, insisted that Deku had been tailing him and demanded an explanation. Deku forced a smile and told Endeavor that he was a fan, that he enjoyed seeing the hero in action. Beneath that polite answer, a darker image flickered through Deku's mind, a spiteful, hateful fantasy of seeing the hero suffer. The thought startled him, but he kept his expression calm. Endeavor watched Deku for a moment, sensing something off in the boy's eyes but deciding he did not have time to investigate. He thought about needing to get home for training with Shoto, and with a short breath he turned and walked away, slightly disappointed it had not been a villain to confront. When Endeavor turned the corner, Deku's face fell. He clenched his fists and stared at the pavement as rage and malice burned inside him, barely held back. A single tear rolled down his cheek and dropped onto the cement. He resolved to keep following Endeavor. Raising his head, he looked toward the direction the hero had gone and began to search again, keeping more distance this time and moving across rooftops. Often he could see only the light from Endeavor's flames. Eventually, Endeavor reached his home and burst through the door, calling loudly for Shoto. A small boy about Deku's age ran into the room. The boy had hair split evenly between red and white, and a large scar covered his left eye. His eyes were two different colors, one brown and one blue. The boy greeted his father in a stiff, forced manner, then bowed awkwardly, his voice tight. There was an unnatural tension in the room and a strong sense of fear. Deku watched from a nearby tree and felt the unease emanating from the household. Something was wrong with this family. Endeavor did not offer a warm greeting. He told Shoto that he was going to get changed and then go to the training room, his tone stern and harsh. Shoto began to shake but walked toward the training room as if compelled. A few minutes later, Endeavor entered the training room wearing a black t-shirt and workout shorts. Without warning, Endeavor lunged forward with a burst of force and shoved Shoto against the wall in a harsh, aggressive training move that left the boy shaken. Endeavor pinned Shoto with one hand and delivered harsh, precise blows to his midsection. Shoto doubled over and gasped, clearly in pain. Endeavor then shoved him to the floor and continued the relentless physical punishment, while Deku watched helplessly from the doorway. Whenever Shoto tried to defend himself, he was pushed back down. The barrage went on for hours without mercy. Soon Shoto looked battered and barely able to move. Then Endeavor announced that training for the day was over. Deku thought calling it training was a lie. It had been abuse, but there was nothing he could do. Shoto lay in the center of the room, bruised and swollen, breathing shallowly. Deku watched as Shoto slowly hauled himself to his feet. He steadied himself for a moment, then began to walk toward the door, each step unsteady. He reached the handle, turned it carefully, and left. Deku noted that Shoto's right eye was swollen shut and his face showed heavy bruising. Even knowing Endeavor's harshness, Deku felt this had gone too far. The next morning the Todoroki house was already stirring before sunrise. Shoto Todoroki ate a quiet breakfast and tended to the visible injuries he could manage. He seemed hollow and fatigued, moving with the slow, mechanical motions of someone who had been pushed past their limits. He gathered his bag, put on his shoes, and left the house. Shoto walked for a mile or two before reaching a large school with a carved stone sign identifying it as Mustafa Private Middle School. The campus was clearly affluent, and Deku had been following Shoto all morning, suspecting this was where Endeavor sent his children. The suspicion was confirmed when Shoto passed through the front gate. Students on the grounds fell quiet as he moved through. People glanced at him, whispered, and then looked away. Rumors and opinions circulated. Many identified him as the son of the number 2 hero. Others commented on his demeanor and physical appearance. Some speculated about his family and past tragedies. A few students spread darker rumors about what had happened to those who got close to him. Teachers treated him with caution as well. Shoto heard the murmurs but kept walking as if he were used to them. Deku watched him all day. During lunch, a girl dropped her phone as Shoto passed. Shoto picked it up and returned it to her. She hesitated briefly, accepted the phone, and hurried away. He sighed softly and continued toward the lunch line. Groups of students made jokes within earshot, but no one approached him earnestly. When the school day ended, most students went home and Shoto began the long walk back. Endeavor was away on an overnight mission, so there would be no training that evening. Deku trailed behind him as dusk fell. The streets grew dark and quiet. Deku felt pity for Shoto. His home life was harsh, he had no friends, and most people kept their distance because of who his father was. It all made Shoto's life look fragile and lonely. A sudden metallic clang echoed ahead, sharp against the settling silence. Deku stopped and stared toward the sound while Shoto continued walking as if he had not heard it. The metallic clang echoed again, closer this time. Deku hopped onto a rooftop and moved in the direction of the noise. The clang grew louder as he approached. He stopped and peered over the edge into a narrow alley. Standing there, peeking around the corner, was a man in large metal boots. The boots had jet-like features on the back and they clanked together with every step. The man cursed about the boots, complaining that they were making the job harder and muttering that he had been ordered to kidnap someone and then forced to test drive the infernal boots. Deku wondered whether the man meant Todoroki. The man crept closer and closer to Todoroki until he was within arm's reach. When he was close enough, he seized Todoroki's arm and slipped a white cloth over his mouth. He kept one hand on Todoroki's arm and the other around his middle to pin him in place. Todoroki froze in shock but quickly tried to struggle free. The cloth had a sedative and it began to take effect. Todoroki's eyelids grew heavy. In a last-ditch effort to break free, he tried to activate his ice quirk, but a sharp pain flared in his left arm. He looked down to find that a syringe had delivered a strange sedative into his arm, and the limb went limp. He could not move it, and he feared his quirk would not respond. As Todoroki's vision blurred, the man's grip unexpectedly loosened. Todoroki tried to run but he was too exhausted. As the man released him, he fell limp to the ground, still fighting to stay awake. Just before he lost consciousness, a greenish figure stooped down in front of him. Todoroki could not open his eyes enough to see clearly. He wondered if he was safe or if this was another threat. The figure was speaking, but the words blurred. 2 minutes earlier, Deku had watched the man approach Todoroki and hesitated, unsure whether he should intervene since nothing overtly violent had happened yet. The moment the man grabbed Todoroki and covered his mouth, Deku's hesitation vanished. He leapt from the roof and landed beside them, then delivered a precise strike to the man that rendered him unconscious. Deku felt a rush of disbelief and excitement at having acted so effectively, and then immediate concern for Todoroki's condition. He bent down and checked on him. Todoroki remained unconscious. A few hours later, Todoroki lay passed out on his living room couch. With a slight groan, he opened one eye and wondered what had happened, where he was, and how he had gotten home. He turned his head and saw a green and black shadow slipping out the door. He tried to lift his arm only to find his left arm numb and limp. His right arm worked fine. As he stretched and flexed, blood returned to the limb and he slowly regained control. After a minute of movement, he tested his ice quirk. It was a little sluggish but mostly functional. He hesitated over whether to test his fire quirk and whether it was worth breaking a promise to himself. He remembered the shadow he had seen and scanned the room, but no one remained. The only person in the room was himself. He chastised himself for forgetting about the arm and, stretching one last time, stood to leave the room. Something high in a nearby tree caught his eye, a dark shape that looked like a person, though it was too dark to make out details. When he squinted, the figure jumped to a higher branch and disappeared into the night. He decided he was too tired to deal with it and went to bed. Deku moved through the city by leaping from tree to tree until he reached the bustling lights of Mizurufu. If one did not know better, the nighttime glow could feel like daytime. He landed on a roof, dropped into an abandoned alley, and removed his claw-like gloves and mask. He had put on his costume when night fell so he would blend into the dark more effectively. He needed to change back into civilian clothes if he wanted to walk in the open street. Since night had fallen, more pros were patrolling the streets, so it was too dangerous to be running on rooftops. After a few minutes, Deku finished changing into the regular clothes he had stored in his bag earlier. He waited for the right moment to slip into the crowd without a pro taking notice and did not have to wait long before he was walking the open streets completely inconspicuous. Time passed and Deku got closer to the hideout. He froze when he saw a familiar figure, Bakugo, leaning against a wall, looking at his phone. Deku worried that Bakugo would recognize him and tried to find a way around. Suddenly there was a crash and everyone froze. People turned toward the sound and saw a 10-foot-tall villain attacking a building. The crowd began to run, people grabbed their children and fled in the opposite direction. Deku was caught in the surge and swept along, bumping into people as the chaos pushed him forward. He nearly fell and feared being trampled, but someone grabbed him and hauled him up out of the crush. A bystander checked on him and expressed relief that he had not been pushed to the ground. Now Deku was dangling by his arms above the street and could see the stampede below. He panicked because he was afraid of heights when he had no control, kicking and trying to get back down. His squirming made the person holding him lose their grip and he began to fall. Before he hit the pavement, something snagged the back of his shirt and stopped his descent. He rose again, not as high this time. A man with shaggy blonde hair and a black and tan hero suit hovered using enormous red wings to keep them aloft. The hero introduced himself as Hawks and told Deku not to squirm because he could have been hurt. Hawks had been there in time. Using his wings, Hawks lowered Deku safely to the sidewalk away from the crowds and then pushed off to soar back into the night. Bakugo watched from nearby, stunned to see someone fall from the sky and then be caught. Hawks had saved him. Bakugo thought the person looked familiar, but he couldn't get a good look. Deku took a moment to breathe and slow his heart. When he focused again, he scanned the busy street for the spiky-haired blonde. His head snapped right and left, careful not to give away his face. To his relief, there was no sign of Bakugo until a firm hand landed on his shoulder and made him jump. Bakugo demanded to know why Deku had been falling from the sky. Deku recognized the voice instantly and froze. If he turned around, Bakugo would see him. If he ran, Bakugo would follow. He needed a plan quickly. Bakugo pulled on Deku's shoulder, calling after him and trying to force him to face him, but Deku kept his head down. Another crash split both of their attention. The street was chaotic. A building had been ripped in half and its top portion dangled precariously. Although many people had evacuated, there were still people in danger and the heroes were spread thin. Deku made a risky decision and ran toward the disaster. Bakugo followed, shouting that Deku was going to get himself killed. Deku kept running. Bakugo accelerated, using explosions to increase his speed and close the gap. He reached out, grabbed Deku's arm and yanked, forcing Deku to spin and face him. Bakugo froze for a heartbeat and, realizing who stood before him, said Deku's name. That hesitation gave Deku the chance to wriggle free and dash toward the site the villain was still rampaging through. The disaster zone was filled with smoke, falling debris, and scattered rubble. Flames licked at the damaged structure and people called out for help from within the severed building. Deku stopped directly under the top half that still hung above, and screams rose from the wreckage around them. People were trapped in the top half of the severed building, unable to escape. Heroes rushed around evacuating civilians and pulling others from the rubble. The few walls and cords still holding the top half above the lower portion, preventing it from crushing Deku, began to snap and crumble. Deku heard the sound of snapping wire and looked up. He saw the cords breaking and the walls giving way. He started to run but then froze. A motionless woman lay trapped beneath a boulder, with flames around her. Deku could not move. Images of his mother trapped under a plank flashed through his mind. The fire felt like it was closing in and he grew dizzy as the world seemed to tilt. Bakugo, running toward the scene, wondered if Deku was even alive and why he was moving into the danger. Bakugo called Deku's name repeatedly as he sprinted. Deku did not respond. Other heroes shouted for him to get out of the way and warned that the building was collapsing. Bakugo reached him and saw Deku dazed and staring at a piece of the building. Bakugo ordered Deku to get out of the way. Dust and debris flew through the air along with shards of building material. Right before Bakugo could be struck by a falling shard of glass, a nearby hero swept him out of the way. He offered no resistance and stared blankly into the distance as he was carried away from the destruction. Bakugo was set down behind police tape at the edge of the battle zone, still in shock from what he had seen. His childhood friend had gone missing, and just as he had found him, the structure above had collapsed and trapped him. The hero who had saved Bakugo berated him for running directly toward the falling building. Bakugo tried to explain that he had been chasing his friend, but the hero said he had seen the boy and decided it was a lost cause. The hero insisted that he made the decisions about who could be saved and argued that if he had gone after the trapped boy, all three of them would have died. He claimed he had reduced the death toll and that Bakugo should be grateful that the hero was still alive. Bakugo shook with anger. He accused the man of letting an innocent person die and called him a fraud for saving himself over a child's life. The crowd behind the tape turned on the hero as they learned what he had done, and soon they were shouting in outrage. The hero fired back with insults, directing most of his anger at Bakugo. At that point, another hero, Backdraft, arrived and listened to the commotion. Backdraft stepped forward, dampened the apprentice's face with a spray of water, and confronted him. Backdraft reprimanded the apprentice harshly, saying that leaving a child under a collapsed structure to save oneself was unacceptable. He reminded the apprentice that a hero's job was to save people no matter the cost and announced that he would see the apprentice's license revoked. The apprentice pleaded for another chance, but Backdraft said there were no second chances when someone had died because of selfishness. Backdraft approached Bakugo, placed a hand on his shoulder, then crouched to meet the boy's eyes. Backdraft confirmed that Bakugo had known the victim. When Bakugo said the victim had been his best friend, Backdraft moved his hand from Bakugo's shoulder and smoothed the blonde's spiky hair in a brusque, almost paternal gesture. He told the apprentice that he owed Bakugo an apology and that returning his hero suit and gear to the agency was the least he could do. The apprentice muttered a grudging apology. As he turned to leave, he lashed out and struck Bakugo in the face. Bakugo managed to avoid a follow-up blow. The apprentice tried to kick Bakugo, but Bakugo grabbed the foot and twisted it sharply, causing the man to cry out. The crowd surged, restrained the man, and pinned him to the ground while others scolded him for his actions. Unbeknownst to most people, a local news crew had been filming the whole exchange live. Backdraft glanced back at the scene where the crowd was holding his former apprentice down and commented that the man had brought this on himself, then walked away. Back at the League of Villains base, everyone watched the same footage on Channel 3 in stunned silence. They had seen a small green figure run beneath a dangling portion of the building and watched as the structure came down. No one moved, they stared at the screen in horror. Shigaraki had been holding the remote, but in his state of shock he accidentally disintegrated it. A whooshing sound announced someone's entrance, and a panicked voice informed the group that he had the victim. Kurogiri appeared, hunched and carrying Deku, who was badly hurt but still alive. Kurogiri said he had been too slow and emphasized that with medical attention the boy should survive. Shigaraki immediately went behind the bar to fetch medical supplies. He hurried for the door and called for Kurogiri to follow quickly. They ran down the corridor, turning a few corners and moving as fast as they could while Kurogiri tried to keep Deku stable. Every few seconds a short, dry breath escaped the limp boy as he lay unconscious in Kurogiri's arms. They reached the med bay, stocked with supplies and equipment. A tall, lanky man in a long white coat stood inside. He had heard them running and was already preparing the station. Kurogiri placed Deku on the examination table. It was clear they had to act fast. The doctor moved around the room, gathering bandages, needles, and other instruments, and asked what had happened. Shigaraki explained that Deku had been caught under falling debris when a building partially collapsed and that Kurogiri had pulled him free just in time. Shigaraki's voice wavered, on the verge of breaking. He was terrified. The doctor began a rapid assessment, manipulating Deku's limbs to check for fractures. He told them he needed both of them to leave the room to perform a necessary procedure and that anyone who was not medical staff must step outside. He then called for Zuzumi and Ascari. Two young women entered wearing surgical attire, blue gloves, and white masks. One had mint green hair in two space buns and dark green, plus-shaped pupils. They stepped back as the medical team took over. Deku returned to his room and sat at the small desk tucked into the corner. He had installed a computer when he arrived but had not used it until now. Reaching under the monitor, he powered it on. The cheap machine took a while to boot, so he left it running and usually only turned the screen off. Once it was ready, he started working. One reason he had been bullied was that he was a nerd, but that also meant he was smart. He could do almost anything, and usually only hacked into systems when he was anxious about a test and wanted to check his grade, which was always 100. This time, however, he intended to dig into no one's favorite hero, Endeavor. He investigated almost every case Endeavor had been paid for, both large and small. Deku also researched the hero's family. He found that Endeavor's wife was in a mental hospital and that the eldest son had died when their house burned down 3 years earlier. Deku dove deeper into Mrs. Todoroki's records. It took a lot of digging. Someone clearly did not want this information to surface. There were no news reports or articles, which struck him as odd because the incidents should have attracted attention. He decided to access the hospital archives and worked through several attempts before gaining entry. In the Todoroki file, he found a note about an incident in which the youngest had been scalded and that Mrs. Todoroki bore scars that appeared to be burn-related, suggesting possible abuse. The new information left Deku saddened for the family but not surprised. He moved on to the children, starting with the eldest son, Toya Todoroki. There was almost nothing on Toya, only a birth certificate and a middle school yearbook photo. Neither document revealed his quirk. Toya's trail went cold after that, and Deku set the search aside. Next he researched Fuyumi Todoroki, the only daughter. She had an ice quirk like her mother and a strong academic record, winning first place in many science fairs and contests. 5 years earlier, when she was 14, she came in second in one competition. The next day she appeared at picture day with injuries to her face and arms. She claimed they were accidental from a new experiment, but the explanation did not match the pattern of harm. Something about the family dynamics did not add up. Natsu Todoroki, another child, also had an ice quirk. He kept a lower profile than Fuyumi, good grades but no after-school activities. Reports mentioned that he had a powerful throwing arm and batting ability and had been invited to join the baseball team, but he had declined and never explained why. Finally, Deku turned his attention to the youngest son, Shoto. The final cord snapped and the top half of the building came loose. The structure tilted, then collapsed in a dramatic, sweeping motion like something out of an action scene, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. Deku looked up just in time to see a friend running toward him with an outstretched hand and calling his name. The falling upper section struck the ground, obliterating everything beneath it. A medic shrugged, stood, and helped his coworker up off the floor. They went to the sinks in the corner, removed their gloves and masks, discarded them, and washed their hands. The medic told them he would give them some time alone and left, leaving Shigaraki beside his unconscious brother. Kurogiri walked back through the main room after escorting Shigaraki to see Deku. A soft meowing came from inside. Kurogiri turned the corner and found the rest of the league playing with a litter of kittens. Twice was lying flat on the floor with a kitten sleeping on his chest. 2 other villains were playfully wrestling with a small cat. Far in a corner, Magna sat cross-legged with an orange kitten asleep in her lap, gently petting it and resting a hand on its back. Kurogiri asked what they were doing. Twice complained that the kitten dug its nails into him whenever he tried to move. Kurogiri asked where the cats had come from. Ignoring Twice, Kurogiri went to Magna. Magna said she thought the kittens had been in Deku's pocket and remarked that they were cute. Kurogiri sat and began to pet the cat, which responded by purring. Magna observed that the kittens seemed to like Kurogiri. Kurogiri wondered aloud why Deku would have kittens in his pocket. Magna shrugged and said Deku was strange and there were many things they could not explain. Twice called for help again, and Magna teased him to toughen up. They spent about an hour in quiet, petting the kittens. Magna asked how Deku was doing and whether he would be all right. Kurogiri recounted what the medic had said. Deku should recover, being young, which usually helped with healing. Magna said Deku had looked very bad. Kurogiri explained that Deku had a cut on his scalp that had bled a lot, and that he had suffered serious injuries to his torso and several broken bones. The description was kept non-graphic and matter-of-fact. One of the kittens lifted its head, mewed, and jumped out of Magna's lap, dashing into the hallway. The other kittens followed. The orange one lagged slightly because of a sore leg but kept up. Twice exclaimed in relief. Magna and Kurogiri stood and ran after the kittens, and Magna deliberately stepped on Twice's stomach as she hurried past him. The kittens dashed down the hallway to the med bay and began scratching at the door, yowling to be let in. Kurogiri and Magna caught up and observed the frantic animals at the entrance. Magna opened the door, and the kittens ran in, leaping onto the bed and settling on Deku's chest. Kurogiri and Magna were surprised to see Deku awake. They were even more surprised by the man standing beside him. Kurogiri and Magna bowed and greeted the newcomer politely. The man was All for One. Deku opened his eyes but closed them again against the sudden light, attempting to raise an arm only to be stopped by a sharp pain that traveled up his limb. He hissed at the pain and held his arm still, then opened his eyes more slowly to let them adjust. He realized he was lying on a bed in a hospital-like room. Turning his head, he saw a familiar face in a chair beside him. Deku called for Shigaraki. Shigaraki looked up from a book, set it aside, and rushed over to Deku's bedside. Shigaraki asked how Deku was feeling. Deku saw that much of his body was covered in bandages and that he had been changed into a hospital gown. Deku said he felt as good as could be expected and gave a short, rueful laugh that was cut short when a new pain tucked into his side. He groaned and braced his hand against his ribs. Shigaraki warned him not to strain himself. Deku asked how he had gotten there. Shigaraki explained that Kurogiri had managed to save him before he was crushed. Deku asked how they had known he needed help. Shigaraki said the whole attack had been broadcast live on television and they had seen him running into the fight. Deku acknowledged that he had, indeed, done that. Shigaraki scolded him for his recklessness and demanded that he start explaining, but before he could finish, the doors to the hallway opened. A tall man walked in wearing a black suit, with tubes extending from the sides of his face, his facial features mostly obscured except for his mouth. Shigaraki immediately noticed and gave him a small, formal bow, calling him father. All for One dismissed the formality and stepped forward to embrace his son briefly, showing a familial affection that seemed at odds with his imposing presence. He said he had intended to visit them and had come sooner when he heard what had happened, and he asked how Deku was doing. Shigaraki told All for One that he could ask Deku himself and stepped aside. All for One looked toward the green-haired boy in the bed and appeared shocked to find him awake. Deku managed a smile and greeted the man as his father. All for One expressed surprise that Deku was awake and asked how he was feeling, speaking with a reserved warmth that showed the importance of family to him. Deku replied that he was honestly surprised to still be alive. All for One apologized for not being there for Deku after Inko had left. All for One remarked that it must have been a hard time and expressed sympathy for what Deku had seen. He looked down as he spoke, overwhelmed with sadness and guilt. He was the most powerful villain in the world, and even with all his power and status he still could not save his wife. Guilt had eaten at him since he found out. If only he had been there. If only he had not left. He should have stayed and he could have saved her. Before his thoughts could spiral further, Deku spoke up. Deku told All for One that he had changed his name to Deku and asked to be addressed by that name going forward. He said there was no need for an apology, insisting it had not been All for One's fault but Endeavor's. Deku's expression grew dark as he named his mother's murderer. Hate surged through him and he felt his blood boil. Shigaraki, who had been standing off to the side, stepped forward on hearing his brother's words. He could not believe that the hero meant to save lives could be involved. He remembered that his mother's death had been caused by fire. Shigaraki reacted with disbelief and anger. Deku explained that he had been taken to the police station after the incident and had overheard a conversation between Endeavor and a detective. He had learned that Endeavor had gone too far, started those fires, and caused the damage, yet the detective intended to press charges against a villain for destruction of property while refusing to arrest Endeavor because he was a hero. Deku spoke the word hero with disgust, his face twisted with disbelief and fury even though he had heard it for himself. It still felt unreal. As Shigaraki absorbed the revelation, something inside him snapped. Even with all his information networks, he had not known this. It looked like a deliberate cover-up, or perhaps only the hero and the detective knew. Shigaraki demanded that they tell everyone and get the story into the news. The public should know. He was visibly furious and seemed ready to strike. All for One urged him to calm down, acknowledging his anger but advising patience. He argued that the information could be used to their advantage if released strategically. Releasing it prematurely could allow it to be dismissed as lies or misinformation. Their better course was to wait until they had solid evidence and release it when Endeavor was most vulnerable, ensuring he could not recover, and to use the revelation as a decisive blow. There were likely other similar incidents to uncover as well. His tone was dark and calculating. To anyone unfamiliar with him, he might have seemed calm, but his sons knew his cold composure masked a terrifying fury. A moment later, the door opened again. Kurogiri and Magna entered, accompanied by a small group of kittens. The animals scampered to where Deku was reclining and one jumped into his lap, causing him to groan at the sudden weight. Kurogiri and Magna bowed deeply to All for One and greeted him respectfully. Over the next few weeks, All for One, Shigaraki, Deku, and the rest of the League of Villains dug up more dirt on the number 2 hero. They uncovered other occasions in which Endeavor had been legally protected despite culpability. Shigaraki repeatedly asked when they would release the information, frustrated by having it sit idle. Deku reminded him to be patient and that they had already discussed the plan. He picked up a glass of water at the bar and watched his brother pace the room. Shigaraki said he understood but could not hide his impatience. This was their chance to strike at the foundations of hero society. Deku cautioned that patience was a virtue and tried to calm him. Shigaraki glared but continued pacing. The next days passed with the same tension. Deku could tell Shigaraki was getting anxious, and he feared that acting too soon would jeopardize their plan. Frustrated by his brother's restlessness, Deku left the base for fresh air. He walked the streets, enjoying the nice weather and the sight of people going about their day. The smells from storefronts made him hungry, so he picked a food stall and sat down to eat. After a while of watching customers come and go, a rough, familiar voice ordered an extra spicy noodle. Deku recognized Bakugo and pulled his hood down to hide his face. The spiky blonde sat 2 seats away. Deku did not want to interact with his old friend, especially since he had thought Bakugo was dead. Bakugo began to call out to Izuku, but his words were cut off by a sudden loud explosion and screams. The storefront across the street erupted, and a criminal with firearm-like appendages emerged, firing wildly as he fled. Bakugo sprang to his feet and rushed toward the threat to minimize harm to bystanders, but the villain moved faster than anticipated and began shooting in his direction. Bakugo braced for impact, but when he opened his eyes he was confronted with a shocking sight. His green-haired friend had been struck and collapsed onto the pavement, weak and unmoving. Bakugo fell to his knees and cradled him, panic and disbelief overtaking him. Bakugo pleaded desperately for Izuku not to die, his voice breaking as he desperately tried to hold on to hope. Bakugo frantically searched for something to save his friend, but there was nothing within reach. No heroes had arrived to the scene yet, and the villain was still on a rampage. Bakugo cried out that it was happening again and then turned back to his friend when he felt a cold hand brush his cheek. Deku's hand fell to his side and his eyes lost their light. With his last strength, Deku urged Bakugo to live because he could not. Bakugo shook him and screamed for him to wake, but nothing responded. Deku did not survive. After the villain was dealt with, Bakugo was taken home to his mother and told her what had happened, including every detail about Izuku. All for One and Shigaraki soon learned the news, and the loss shattered Shigaraki. Bakugo grew up to become the number 1 hero in his friend's place, determined to fulfill Izuku's final wish to live. One of them had dark purple hair tied into a high ponytail that reached her shoulders and wore a very tired expression. The green-haired girl ran to the back of the room and grabbed a gray cart stocked with tools and supplies, pushing it up beside the table where Deku lay. The doctor pulled up a wheeled chair and donned a mask and gloves. Zuzumi, the green-haired girl, began hooking tubes and wires to Deku and connecting them to a large machine. Shigaraki refused to leave, insisting he would not just walk away. Kurogiri urged Master Tomera to let the doctor work and to follow his instructions. Shigaraki shouted no. A cloud of purple mist gathered around Shigaraki, and both he and Kurogiri vanished. A dark stain was spreading beneath Deku, and Ascari, the purple-haired girl, worked desperately to contain it. The doctor suggested that Ascari use her quirk to speed up the cleanup. Ascari lifted her head, nodded, and stopped laying down towels. She closed her eyes and placed her hands in the spill. As she breathed, the stain drew into her hands. With each controlled breath, more of the spill sank into her until it seemed to clear, though new fluid kept replacing it. The doctor worked steadily to close Deku's wounds, and the flow slowed as the repairs progressed. Ascari continued to absorb the leaking fluid, which kept coming for a time. Zazumi stayed at the doctor's side, handing him instruments and disposing of soiled bandages. When the doctor requested more penicillin, Zazumi pressed her hands together and emitted a soft green light. When she opened them, a small cluster of pills rested in her palm. She handed them to the doctor, who prepared and administered them so they dissolved as intended. After several hours, the surgery was complete and the doctor was stitching up Deku's leg after realigning the bone. Zazumi and the doctor were exhausted and looked half asleep, while Ascari appeared suddenly invigorated and full of energy. Ascari declared she felt exhilarated and decided to go for a run, then dashed out the door, her cheerful whoops echoing down the hall. Ascari's quirk allowed her to absorb surrounding matter and convert it into stamina, so she was noticeably energized after absorbing so much. Zazumi collapsed on the floor, spent and panting. Her quirk let her convert her own nutrients into medicine, and for now she could only manufacture pills. Shigaraki had seen Ascari racing down the corridor and burst back into the room, frantic. He asked whether the operation was over. The doctor confirmed it was, explaining that Deku would need a long PRD of rest and was currently unconscious. Shigaraki moved to his brother's side, tears evident on his face, and asked about Deku's chances. The doctor said the outlook was fairly good, but that without getting him there when they did, Deku likely would not have survived. The end.